Howdy again everyone, and once more we're visiting Voigtländer land with a test of their new manual focus full frame 50mm f1 lens for Canon RF mount cameras. Nice! I love ultra bright aperture lenses, particularly on full frame cameras. This particular lens is expensive though, at $1,800 US or about £1,600 here in the UK, so let's hope it's a cut above some of the cheaper 50mm f0.95 lenses on the market. I'd like to thank Voigtländer very much for loaning me this lens for a couple of weeks for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review and I'll be taking a look both at its strengths and its weaknesses. Something else to mention is that Voigtländer has scored a minor coup with this lens. It's my understanding that this is the first third-party lens with electronic contact to be officially permitted by Canon onto their RF mount system. As I mentioned, it's a manual focus only lens, but those electronic contacts allow EXIF information to the camera, including aperture information, but not aperture control. It also means your camera will automatically recognize it as a 50mm lens and set its in-body stabilization appropriately if your camera has that feature, and also it engages Canon's manual focus aids, which I found worked very well with this lens, helping you to focus on still subject more quickly and quite accurately too, making the lens really enjoyable to use. That aid even works with eye detection. The lens didn't seem to support in-camera corrections for optical issues though. Turned on or off they seemed to make no real difference to the image in my eyes, but those 50mm f1 pictures still look seriously spectacular as you can see, although they have a lot of vignetting at the brightest apertures. Anyway, let's look at the lens's build quality first, which is absolutely gorgeous. Voigtländer lenses rarely let you down in this department. It's big, metallic, and at 650 grams or about 1.5 pounds, pretty weighty but not excessively cumbersome. A minor letdown is that the lens has no visible weather sealing around its mount, something we really do expect at this kind of price point. The main control on the lens is a broad metallic focus ring, which turns beautifully smoothly with just the right weight to it, and with a turn of 180 degrees it is precise enough for focusing at f1 without any trouble, and as I mentioned, Canon's manual focus aids kick in nicely when turning it. As you can see here though, the lens suffers from significant focus breathing in use, zooming in as you focus more closely. In front of the focus ring comes the aperture ring. It turns beautifully with gentle clicks, evenly spaced at each third of an f-stop, and the aperture mechanism has 12 straight iris blades. We'll see what kind of sunstars it produces in a few minutes. The lens comes with a fairly narrow metal screw-on lens hood, and its filter size is 67mm. It does not feature image stabilization. Overall, gorgeous build quality here, and it handles and focuses very well, although of course it'll take a bit of practice for anyone who isn't used to manually focusing. Okay then, image quality. I'll be testing this one on a full frame camera, my Canon EOS R5 with its 45 megapixel sensor. Even though they don't seem to do anything, I turned in-camera corrections on for this test anyway. At f1, we are seeing some softness in the middle on contrasting edges, although admittedly a quite usable image is still being captured and contrast seems to be fairly good. In the image corners we see a lot of darkness, and although some good detail is still being captured here, it's being smeared away somewhat by what is probably very high chroma levels. Stop down to f1.4 for more brightness and contrast in the corners, and the middle is looking sharper also, although still not perfectly sharp. Stop down to f2 though, and the middle suddenly becomes razor sharp. Nice. At f2 the corners are looking very good now, also much brighter and fairly sharp. At f2.8 and f4 there's a little extra brightness and clarity, but at f5.6 and f8 those corners look essentially perfect. Stop down to f11 and f16 though, and diffraction starts causing increased softness. So, overall, considering its price, I do wish this lens were a bit sharper at f1, that's for sure, but its contrast is always quite good, its corners aren't bad either, and it does sharpen up quickly upon stopping down the aperture. At f2 especially, its images look great. It's certainly quite a bit better than competing, cheaper 50mm f0.95 manual focus options. Alright, let's see about vignetting and distortion, again on a full frame camera. The good news is that distortion isn't really visible here. Vignetting, however, is very strong at f1. If you stop down to f1.4, f2, f2.8 and f4, those corners gradually brighten up. This lens can focus down to 45cm, just average for a 50mm optic. At f1, close-up image quality is pretty terrible, as you can see. f1.4 sees a small improvement in contrast, however f2 and f2.8 quickly sharpen up very well. Let's see about work against bright lights now. Here is another area where the lens performs way better than cheaper 50mm f0.95 lenses. Even at f1, we are still seeing good contrast and very little flaring, so that's an impressive achievement. While we're working in the dark, let's take a look at chroma levels. Unfortunately, the force is strong with this one. At f1, there's simply a huge amount of chroma smearing to be seen in image corners. At f1.4 and at f2 it's reduced. At f2.8 traces remain, but at f4 those points of light look pretty clean. Well, let's adjust the position and look for sunstars. At f1, of course, they're not visible, although at f1.4 hints of them begin to appear just narrowly. Those stars remain subtle down to f4, although from f5.6 down to f11 they start getting really quite strong. Oddly, when I was topped down to f16, they went away again. Strange behaviour there. Next, bokeh. The lens's out-of-focus backgrounds look wonderfully smooth here, again, better than the cheaper 50mm f0.95 alternatives I've tested in the past, with clean, shapely, specular highlights. However, the lens's relatively small rear glass element means that we get a strong cat's eye shape to bokeh highlights in the image corners, annoyingly. And finally, related to bokeh comes longitudinal chromatic aberration. At f1 it's strong and stays strong at f1.4 and f2. At f2.8 though it's far better, and at f4 it's finally gone. Overall, I ended up with mixed feelings about the Voigtländer 50mm f1. I loved using it, that's for sure. Its build quality is lovely, and with my Canon camera's manual focus assistance and in-body stabilization, I found it quite easy to shoot with and manually focus. Well, if my subject wasn't moving, that is. I also loved the look of its images and how they looked on my camera's screen after taking them out in the field. Its contrast is good, and its transmittance seems to be really high. I haven't mentioned that before, but I was getting very fast shutter speeds at f1. It definitely performs better than the cheaper 50mm f0.95 lenses that I've tested in the past. Looking at my images at home on the computer though, I was disappointed by its mediocre sharpness at f1, and I wish in-camera corrections would correct some of that crazy vignetting. Well, here's where I would put the lens in terms of image quality, almost directly between the more expensive but autofocus Canon RF 50mm f1.2L and a cheap and cheerful manual focus 50mm f0.95. I still think the lens is overpriced for what you're getting here, but still, it's seriously enjoyable to use and can get some really beautiful pictures for you. Well, no matter what the price, there's no doubt that Voigtländer are getting really active in putting out beautiful and interesting new lenses, and I love getting them all reviewed for you as soon as possible. I want to say a huge thanks, as usual, to my Patreon supporters who so generously help to keep this YouTube channel going. Check out my Patreon page in the description below, where supporters get all kinds of exclusive bonus content. Ciao for now, everyone.